All right, we're live. Welcome to PsiChat, and tonight we are really happy to have Brandon Massullo with us, and we're going to talk about his book, The Ghost Studies, that was published in 2017. We're going to talk a little bit about the science of ghosts and get into some of the data and some of the debates and some of the information. And we really look forward to hearing what Brandon has to share with us tonight. So a little bit about Brandon. Brandon's a clinical therapist and parapsychologist residing in Northeast Ohio. He's currently the director of behavioral health for a local hospital. He received his undergraduate degree in psychology as well as his graduate degree in clinical counseling from the University of Toledo. He also has a Master of Science, which is the equivalent of a master's degree in the US in psychological research methods from the University of Edinburgh, centered on neurobiological correlates of ghostly encounters. And we will talk a little bit about his master's dissertation. And he studied within the parapsychology unit at the University of Edinburgh under the supervision of author and international lecturer, Dr. Carolyn Watt. Brandon has been fascinated by paranormal phenomena for 20 years and has been a participant and featured speaker in numerous paranormal forums and events, including the Parapsychological Association's 60th anniversary celebration. His research has been cited in parapsychological journals, newspaper articles, and mainstream books. Brandon provides a unique viewpoint of his research into ghosts due to his education and experience in both clinical and research psychology. Between his clinical and directorial positions as well as his research, Brandon has interviewed many and collected hundreds of real-life ghostly encounters. So with that, Brandon, welcome to PsiChat.
Thanks for having me, Dave and Jen. Appreciate it. Great
Glad
to be here.
Glad you're here.
Glad you're here. So I guess to start off with, what got you interested in parapsychology and ghosts and hauntings?
Well, you know, it starts with Ghostbusters, as you can see in my background here.
Us too.
Very
I
nice.
mean, that's really kind of what got me going. I remember watching the movie and seeing and hearing parapsychology for the first time, and just started to get interested in it, and then starting to figure out a little bit about kind of the science behind what they were doing, like the PKE meter, the Zener cards that they were using in the show. So that's kind of what got me interested in it. And then in high school, I started reading books about parapsychology. Went down to the local library because back then there wasn't a lot on the internet. Picked up every book I could on parapsychology and just started reading it. Didn't really tell anybody. That's just kind of how it was, you know. You keep that stuff to yourself because you know you didn't really talk about ghosts to people. You didn't do that type of thing back then. So I would read the books, and I read through everything. Went to Barnes and Nobles, bought as much books as I could. And then I went and studied psychology at the University of Toledo. And I started doing clinical work. And then about a year or two into clinical work, I decided, you know what? I really like parapsychology. I'm going to give it a shot. So I applied to the University of Edinburgh. And then they accepted me, and I flew over to Scotland and studied there for a little over a year, and really learned the most in that year than I did reading for the previous 10 years. And then I came back to the States and got back into clinical work, but I still do writing and some lit review stuff on the side right now. So I don't really have a cool story. I don't have any sort of, I didn't live in a haunted house. I didn't, my family's not, we don't talk about ghosts really. It was a shock to a lot of people, my classmates included, when this book came out, The Ghost Studies, because they really didn't know I even liked ghosts or anything like that. So I kind of I kept it hidden. I always tell the story of my girlfriend found my parapsychology book. I used to hide it underneath my bed like a Playboy. And she found it one time, and she was like, "What's this?" I was like, "Oh, I'm just holding that for a friend, you know." So it's weird.
I don't know if that's better or worse than a Playboy, but okay.
So that's kind of how it was for me, at least, because my friends didn't talk about ghosts. We weren't sort of
Right.
that way, but I really liked reading about it, and most people who ever read about parapsychology, whether it's articles or books, it's just fascinating to read about.
Yeah, it is.
It is.
Definitely.
Mhm.
Yeah, I got to say, totally jealous. You got to go overseas and study
Oh, yeah.
parapsychology. I took Dr. Watt's online course a couple years ago, and it was fantastic. And I'm thinking, if I wasn't having to make money and pay for a house and cars and all this other thing, kids and all that, I would have loved to have done that too. So I'm totally jealous, and that's just a great experience, and very envious of you. So
Right.
that's really cool.
That's
Yeah.
times two.
Yeah, well, I will say this, though. A lot of what I studied was statistics and
That's
developing
perfect.
research.
That's what Dave does. Or,
Yeah.
Okay.
Dave. That's what Dave does. No,
I-
other way.
Yeah,
See, now
that
I'm
one.
more jealous. You're not helping any. You're not helping any.
Yeah. So it was the dissertation part was the best part of it, which is actually working with your supervisor, Dr. Watt, and coming up with a hypothesis and how you're going to test it, and reviewing the statistics and getting participants. And that part was really interesting and fun. And there were some classes on parapsychology. So a lot of papers were written about things like that. So I loved it. It was a great year. I was the only American in the program, the psychological research program. So it was a little overwhelming, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. It was a great year. So.
That's awesome.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the research you did for your master's. Environmental sensitivity and paranormal experiences. I think that was in 2008 that your dissertation was published. Tell us a little bit about the research that you did there and what it involved and what you found.
Well, the environmental sensitivity is something that's it wasn't something that I developed. It was developed by I shouldn't say developed, but Michael Jower was the one who really brought it to the forefront in parapsychology, and what his research articles were about was this idea that there's a subset of the population that's environmentally sensitive. And when I say environmentally sensitive, what I'm talking about has nothing to do with psychic sensitivity, like Sylvia Brown or James or any of these types of people, Chip Coffees of the world. What it has to do with is just sort of the ability to more sensitive to the environment that's around us. So these people tend to get overwhelmed with chemicals. They get overwhelmed with fluorescent lighting. They tend to have fibromyalgia, allergies, multiple chemical sensitivities, things like that, migraines. They're just impacted by the environment a lot more than everybody else. And what they found was that this population also had way more paranormal experiences than the general population. I think of those who were classified as environmentally sensitive, they were actually, of that populations, I think it was almost 70% had a paranormal experience previously, which is a huge number. And so the question becomes, why is this population having more paranormal experiences than the general population, if you want to say that? And then, that's sort of, Jower was the one who found these types of things happening, the differences between environmental sensitivity and general population. And then what I did for my research was I tried to see if that was true again. So tried to replicate that. And then I tried to see if that was true in a haunted location as well. So what we essentially did was we took, I don't even remember. We took 250 participants. And have you ever heard of Mary King's Close? It's a haunted location in Edinburgh. What it is it's basically like an underground city. And back in the olden days, I don't even remember when it was, 1700s, people used to live underground because the above ground was so overwhelmed. So they would go downstairs, they would go and almost underground. They had stores down there, apartments down there, whatever you want to call it. But a lot of shady stuff went down there. It was a lot of low income things, population down there. So
Got a little demolition man going on down there, huh?
that's right. Exactly. Kind of, yeah, exactly like Demolition Man. But so apparently they say they walled people up down there during the plague. I don't know if that's true or not, but a lot of ghostly happenings happen down there.
Oh.
So what we did was we took 250 participants and we gave them, before they went through the haunted location, we gave them a survey. And what the survey basically did was it categorized them as either environmentally sensitive or not. And then they went down in the location and then they went through the rooms. And if they had a checklist with them, if they had an experience, then they would check off like temperature change, visual apparition, auditory, tactile, whatever the experience was. And then they would come back up and then we would sort of tally that. So we had 250 participants who went through a haunted location. How many experiences do you think were reported during this? If you had
Probably
a guess.
3/4.
Okay. Okay.
That's what I would think.
Dave, you have a guess?
I would say 60 to 70%.
Actually, more than that. So 601 experiences.
Wow.
So people were having multiple experiences.
Really?
Nice.
Yeah. So of the 250, we had 601 experiences reported. So that's quite a bit.
Yeah.
You know, there was tactile phenomenon, there was auditory, there was visual, there was change in temperatures, sense of presence. All these things were happening. One person, I can't remember if they passed out or had some sort of experience, and the EMS had to come pull them out of the clothes.
Oh wow!
So it was a lot. It was intense for a lot of people. So we got pretty good numbers.
Did they happen in certain areas? Was it clustered in certain areas where other things had been reported?
Well, there wasn't really a cluster per se.
Okay.
What we did was we had, I can't remember how many rooms were actually down there, but we only utilized 10 rooms. There might have been like 15 rooms altogether. And we threw some of them out. I can't remember the exact reason why, but what we found was people were having more experiences in rooms that had higher EMF. Again, the way I took EMF was sort of rudimentary, so I wasn't getting 90,000 EMF samples in a minute or anything like that. It was just a handheld meter. So it wasn't really too accurate. But again, back in 2001, 2002, the Edinburgh Vaults, Richard Wiseman, this is what this is what was used. You know, we didn't have all this computer stuff that was going on probably nowadays. So they weren't really clustered. What we did was, prior to them going in the tour, if they had knowledge of which rooms were supposed to be haunted, we excluded them from the survey. So if they knew one room was really haunted, we took that out. If they had prior knowledge of the location, we took that out. So we got rid of some of that. But what we found is those who were environmentally sensitive had, I think, 3 times as many experiences as the general population.
Oh, wow.
It's interesting. Yeah. So Dave, help me out here. What is that rock that's underground that is very big for?
Well, some people think quartz, but
no,
I mean,
that's not what I was thinking. And that's my fault because I can't think of it right now. But there is a rock that is under a lot of houses that a large portion of why certain places.
I've heard granite, river rock, sandstone. We hope not, but granite is supposed to be one of the big ones.
Yeah.
Was it limestone?
Limestone. There it is. Yeah, there it is.
Okay, sorry about that.
The expert.
Yes. So yeah, we've heard that limestone is it indirectly
seems conducive,
and it collects energy and it can just spurt out at any time. I don't know what you want to call it, but emit itself, and then people can have certain it can affect people's brainwaves and such like that. So could that have had any correlation of what's going on in that situation?
I don't know. We didn't do all the environmental things.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Limestone is one of those things that's, I don't know how you measure that. I don't know how you, especially in an underground with, I don't know when this place was built, probably 1400s or something like that, to know what's actually in the walls. I'm not sure. But one of the things you want to do is you want to try to rule these things out, infrasound, get a little idea. Maybe one room has more limestone. I don't know how you figure that out.
Yeah, that's difficult to do, but
yeah. And so you try to do that. We took EMF readings. We took them a week before we did the experiment. And then every morning and afternoon, I would go through and do it as well, if I recall correctly.
okay.
So we got some fairly baseline readings in the rooms. So we tried to do that as best we could. And we also found, like I said, people were having more experiences in rooms that did have higher EMFs. So does that mean that these people who are really sensitive to the environment are picking up on perhaps EMFs and then misinterpreting them as ambiguous stimuli and then causing anomalous experiences?
Okay.
So if let's say I'm really sensitive to EMF and I start getting nauseous and sense of a presence or something like that, it could be related maybe to EMF, and then they were misinterpreting that.
Okay. Did your I'm sorry, keep going.
No, go ahead. Well, I was going to say that as far as our sensitivity to things, it seems to lie on a continuum. So there's some people who, as far as the environment goes, I could walk into a room that has fluorescent lighting and I'm sitting next to a guy with about 10 gallons of Old Spice on, and I'm sitting in a chair that's just been cleaned with bleach and chemicals, and I don't react at all. Another person could walk in and get headaches from the lighting, start getting a rash from the Old Spice and start coughing, and then getting a rash from the cleaning supplies as well.
Sure.
So we all react to the environment differently, and it falls on a continuum. Back in 2007, this idea of a magnetic sense was sort of in its infancy. Now in 2020, there's a lot more research saying that magnetic sense is similar to our other senses like taste, touch, and smell. It might fall on a continuum. And if it does fall on a continuum, maybe those who are more sensitive to the environment would pick up on sort of magnetic abnormalities than the average general person would, right? So if my sense of smell is really high, I could walk into a house and know that they just had curry or whatever. But if my sense of smell is really low, I wouldn't be able to tell that. Same with magnetic sense. It varies on a continuum. So if I walk into a room, I might feel things like from computers or street lamps or whatever. It might impact me a little bit more than the general population. So that sense thing, the environmental sensitivity, these people tend to just be more in tune with the environment. And that's not a supernatural thing. That's a natural thing. And if the paranormal happens in the environment, perhaps they're picking up on something. But on the opposite end, they could be misinterpreting something that's completely normal. They're just really, really sensitive to it.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that's great. That's a great.
Yeah, that's good.
That's great. I like that. So
yeah,
I guess
magnetic sense is one of those things that I think is just an ultimately fascinating thing. And it has a lot of bearings in psychology and parapsychology and things like that.
it's great. It's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the actual strength of the field, and I think in your dissertation you'd mentioned like the mean and areas where people had more experience, it was like 2.9 milligauss, and in the other areas it was like 1, so it's approximately 3 times higher. A lot of work, and I think you reference it in the book by Braithwaite and others, the magnetic anomaly detection system, the MAD system, where they looked at things more than just the amplitude or the strength of the field. They looked at other things. So I know Jen I think you were going to ask something about variances, and I'm sorry if I'm stepping on your question there, hon. But the variance of the fields as well. It seems like that what do they call them? Experience-inducing fields have all these unique characteristics where in temporal and spatial variation, they seem to fluctuate quite a bit.
Yeah. It has to do they call them complex fields, which means they're just erratic. So they found that when the fields are more complex or erratic, that tends to be something where experience-inducing fields happen.
Okay.
So, but and also you mentioned variance. So, walking from one side of the room, which has a really high EMF, to the other side of the room, which has a low EMF, the shift from one to the other could have sort of internal consequences that some people might feel, and might interact with their brain in a way. So going from, I don't know, 700 milligauss down to 25 milligauss could impact the brain. With Braithwaite, he had, I'm going to shoot from the hip a little bit, but he had people in a bed, like an iron mesh bed, and he took readings from, I think, their head maybe down to their stomach, and the difference was something like 900 milligauss or something like that.
Oh,
Really?
wow. Big difference.
There was a huge difference. Don't quote me on the numbers, but there was a huge difference. And when they moved on the metal bed, it was causing more fluctuations or complex fields. So a lot was happening. And we sometimes take for granted because we can't see it, but there's all this crap happening around us in the EMF fields. And it does impact our brains to some degree.
Absolutely.
The thing about Persinger, which gets a lot of heat, is that he said that this happens between 10 milligauss and 40 milligauss, which is around us.
Right.
Neuropsychology they don't say it's a fact that if they shoot magnetic fields into your brain, stuff's going to happen. It could shut parts of your brain off. TMS, transmagnetic stimulation, is something that they do in a lot of psychological studies. They just shoot that right in there. So they know EMFs impact the brain, but the controversy comes because those are really high levels.
So it's a little different when they do the transcranial, though, where it's just kind of on top of the skull, right?
So you're talking about the God helmet, right?
Well, the God helmet is actually a lot less intense than transmagnetic stimulation.
Okay.
What they'll do is they'll put like a magnet over somebody's brain, and they'll shoot a lot of EMFs in there, I guess, and it'll hamper that part of the brain, and they can see maybe over here this has to do with memory or something like that.
Okay.
It's a tool used quite a bit in neuropsychology. And I'm not a neuropsychologist, but I know that cognitive psychologists or psychologists use it all the time. But it's a high amount directed at a certain spot.
Right.
Stuff you wouldn't find in the normal environment.
Okay, that's not what you're talking about here, though, right? Is that what you said? Okay.
What I'm talking about, Persinger says that these complex fields can happen between 10 milligauss and 40 milligauss, which we come in contact with very regularly.
Yeah, that's a normal. We should be, conditioned to that.
We're bathed in that.
Yeah,
right.
That's what the God helmet is. It's a frequency pattern between 10 milligauss and 40 milligauss. And I think in Braithwaite's paper too, he doesn't replicate Persinger's research, but he does say that between 10 milligauss and 40 milligauss, there could be something happening as well.
Okay.
So this is happening in the normal environment, is kind of what they're saying, and that to me, it could mean a lot of things are happening. The average household has 3 milligauss in it, but as I walk through it, I could come in contact in front of the dishwasher or the TV to 10 milligauss very easily.
Absolutely.
Right.
At work, you probably come across that way more than you think about.
Oh yeah.
So sometimes people are like, well, EMFs don't impact us. And then I'll tell them, I've been telling this for 10 years. If that's the case, then put your baby's crib next to the fuse box. If you
exactly. I saw that in your book, and I'm just like, yeah.
Nobody's going to do that.
And then you go, and then the person goes, oh, it's going to impact their brain or their functioning or the growth. Well, then what are we arguing about?
Right.
But I think there's more data that's coming out that shows that there might be effect. And I put it on one of our Facebook pages. I think there was the April 2019 of eNeural, where they're showing that there's a transduction of the geomagnetic field that's shown by alpha band activity in the human brain. It's a really small, but what they're showing is that if you rotate the field just a little bit, these low-level fields, you actually get an alpha band response, which your brain, as you talked about, maybe it's seeing it as some sort of ambiguous stimulation. And then you get into the whole theoretical, is there magnetite in the brain? Is it in the cells? Are you able to, what's the mechanism of transducing that signal? But there seems to be more and more evidence. I mean, you talked a little bit about it. There's also other studies where, I think I'm not sure who it was, but maybe it was Persinger or others that went in and found that people who were having paranormal experiences, that there was a really high up and down amplitude peak valley of electromagnetic fields thrown off by like a clock radio.
Yeah.
So there's data there to support it. I think they're learning more and more that this might be something that is a cause of this. But I guess the question is, how do you know? Is it causing you to ambiguous stimulation, or is it causing you, or is something else there manipulating it, and you're picking up a signal?
Yeah, exactly. And you don't know, because finding out what it impacts in your body, where it impacts it, and what's going on. It could happen at a cellular level that we really aren't able to see. So they have to use a lot of sort of uncommon or alternative methods, nonlinear is what they call them, methods of trying to figure out how EMFs impact our body. And there's a lot of good research out there. Robert Becker, I can't remember.
Becker, yep.
Andrew Marino has done a lot of nonlinear methods and come up with this idea that these small amounts are impacting us. I've watched a couple lectures which basically talk about how the EMFs in our houses can impact us to some degree, and we really have to start paying attention to that. I mean, we check for radon. Was it radon? I can't remember. Yeah, we check for these things in our houses, and EMFs could be something we should probably check for as well. I think Sweden and some of the European countries have levels. California has a level too. They say your house shouldn't be above 3 milligauss or something like that. So there are these. They're not regulatory agencies, but they're people who are giving suggestions of really where things should be. It's just something to keep an eye on, and the research comes out all the time about it. I have academia, and they email me stuff on it all the time. So it's I think it's getting to the point where it's not like 10 years ago when I was writing this paper, there was few research on it. Now there's quite a bit.
Yeah, it's just more and more. So I think what I've heard from the skeptical community is, electromagnetic fields don't do everything they claim on the ghost hunting shows, which, okay, the ghost hunting show is entertainment. Let's put that aside. But the fact that electromagnetic fields, magnetic fields probably have some sort of influence or impact on us if we're picking it up as ambiguous stimuli or something else. I think there's data that's starting to be generated that show that these things actually do affect us.
Yeah. I think I 100% agree with you. And if we have a magnetic sense, which, I think research is pointing to the idea that animals have it. There's a tiny worm that has it. Maybe we have it as well, and it impacts us at a small cellular level. And some people are impacted by it more than others, and these people are really sensitive to it, whereas others are maybe not. But that doesn't mean it doesn't impact them.
Right.
So, I try not to, like you talk about ghost hunters and detecting ghosts with EMF, and obviously that's not happening.
Come on, that K2 meter can pick that up, right?
Yeah, that's right. You're not detecting a ghost with that. I don't think. And if you were, there's no way to really sort of prove it unless you can consistently show some sort of pattern with it. And I don't know how you do that. I know that Dr. Gary Schwartz is working on something called a soul phone, but he went away from EMFs and he's using more biophotons and light to sort of communicate, supposedly communicate. I don't know anything really about that, but we all have these methods, and if you can do it consistently and you can show sort of some sort of intelligent conversations or some sort of data that you can pull from it, I think he puts like a light sensor inside a dark box inside a dark box inside a dark box, so no light is getting in, and then they ask spirit to go inside the box and put light in it, and it responds. So what's happening, right? I don't know. but if you do that consistently, maybe you could have some sort of idea that, something's being communicated. Now, that's what I'm talking about, is breaking it down. With EMF meters, you can't really do that because there's so many freaking variables in every room you walk into. There's so much going on. There's geomagnetic fields. There's electromagnetic fields. You have an air conditioner kicking on. You have wires that could be faulty in your ceiling that are shooting off a lot of EMFs. Someone turns a light on and your readings are going like, there's so many variables with EMFs. And especially if you got an EMF reader where you're getting, just one reading per minute, it's just not, there's not much you can do with it.
Right.
Well, so Brandon, I wanted to tell you that I think the one thing not the one thing, but the thing I thought was very, very great about your book is that it started on a lower end, get to know me, understand how this works kind of level, kind of basic level. And it rose as the chapters went on to like a very higher level of awareness of this topic. And I think it was great because you as an author took the reader with you on this journey. And I thought it was done brilliantly. I think it was really amazing. I mean, it's very rare that you can find a book that will do that to take someone from that level and take them along. And it was really well done. Do you want to respond?
I was just going to say thank you. That's right.
Perfect. Well, you're welcome. You did a great job at that.
And I appreciate it. It took 6 years to write. So it wasn't something that I did over a long weekend or anything like that. I put a lot of time. I put a lot of effort into it. It has 250 references or citations, most of them peer-reviewed journals. I tried to back up everything that I was communicating with some sort of research or someone else's thoughts on it, and that takes a long time to do, especially in a book that's as big as it is, which is only 180 pages or whatever.
You did it really well, and I think the first chapter, the one on the ingredients of what it takes to the ingredients theory, ghost ingredients theory, I think it's called. I think that is really fascinating. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So the ghostly ingredients theory is this basic idea of, before I wrote the book, I was a big fan of crisis apparitions, which I'm sure you guys know.
Yeah, it was something in one of the chapters that I had read that I thought, isn't that a crisis theory or crisis apparition? But you didn't state that, so I was just questioning that. But go ahead, keep going.
But those are what I find to be cases with the least amount of variables in them. And crisis apparitions are basically apparitions that happen to a person who's not expecting it. And they usually coincide with some sort of life-threatening trauma or something on the other end. So I wake up in the middle of the night, I see my aunt floating towards me, saying, "I love you, goodbye." At that same time, my aunt passed away from a heart attack 900 miles away.
Okay.
Right? So you have this death that happens, and automatically you have an apparition that's of someone in crisis. So these are great because it really takes away a lot of the variables associated with things. And it also, the odds of that happening are pretty astronomical. If I've never had experience in my life and I have one at the moment I see my aunt at the moment of her death, that's kind of, the odds of that happening are astounding. So it's hard to
but it happens.
well, it's hard to debunk that to some
Right.
degree. I mean, you could always say people misremember or make up or attention seeking. I don't know if that's necessarily true with all of them. But anyway, so I started thinking about crisis apparitions because there's a lot of that in the parapsychological research and books going all the way back to the 1800s. And I started thinking, what happens? What the paranormal and crisis apparitions are such a complex phenomenon. There has to be several things that sort of line up for this to happen.
Right.
And then I kind of sat down and I read through all the research and I came up with some key points, which is the catalyst, in my opinion, is some sort of psychological thing. In this case, it's a life-threatening event which could be a heart attack of my aunt, there's a lot of emotions with that, and fear, anxiety, I'm dying, anger, guilt, regret, all these emotions that are just boiling over.
Mhm.
And I really felt like emotions really reverberate throughout the entire body. And when that happens, you change sort of your internal electrical fluctuations to some degree. We talked about EMS before.
Mhm.
As humans, we're all energy, so um, uh, internal electrical fields are fact. EEGs, EKGs are all based on sort of electrical impulses and changes in our body.
Okay.
And there's some, and I
Mhm.
go over a whole chapter about there's how emotions impact us internally.
Mhm.
So this impacts us internally. Our electrical sense doesn't stop at our brains; it goes out into the world. And once our EMFs are into the world, there's nothing you can really. Once EMFs are into the world, you can't stop them. When you turn on your toaster, that's going all the way out into the universe. The
Mhm.
EMFs from that. So I felt like internal psychological things happen that causes internal fluctuations. These internal fluctuations sort of leak out into the environment,
Mhm.
and then my
Mhm.
aunt, somehow this telepathic distress signal is in the environment, and it resonates with somebody, usually a family member, that could be a distance away.
Mhm.
and, and resonating or entangling is sort of like a radio station. I use that in the book. So we're surrounded by radio waves, but if I tune my car to 92.5, it connects or resonates with 92.5 in the air, and it comes through on my
Mhm.
radio.
Mhm.
I think sometimes resonation or synchronization can happen, and that's usually why they have a crisis apparition of some kind. So
Mm.
all these things are sort of the ingredients, and then obviously the paranormal experience.
Great.
So, and again, with my book, I do have a lot of regrets as I read it. One of the things that I do regret is I used the word theory, and I should have used the word hypothesis. And this is something that I've keeps me up at night, but at the same time, I have to understand that um, this is not a scientifically based theory; it's my
Right.
hypothesis. Okay, and I don't want to go around saying that this is a scientific theory or anything like that. Uh,
Mhm.
so I do regret that part of it. I think a lot of it had to do with theories are really what people buy books for and things like
Right.
that. And it's
And
really when you see a hypothesis, you go, what is that?
well, and
So go
I
ahead.
think on top of that, the general public, I don't think they know the difference between hypothesis and theory. I really don't. I
Mhm.
mean, I've seen a lot of people misuse this word, not that you did, but just I've seen people misuse it knowing that that's what they just understand as being theory,
Mhm.
even if it's not tested or not, and
Mhm.
and I think that by using that word, you were pretty accurate because that's what people understand. And people, because as I said earlier, this is your book bringing people, along with you. And so people wouldn't understand hypothesis. So I think you did a really good
Yeah.
job of using
Yep.
theory.
So I took, and a lot of this, the ghostly ingredients theory is not something that's completely brand new. I took a lot of my um, motivation from Phantasms of the Living, which is
Yeah.
Myers and Gurney and thought transference and the role of
Mhm.
telepathy and vertical hallucinations. They knew that there was this connection between when someone had a life-threatening event resulted in some sort of a crisis apparition. It usually happened to a family
Mhm.
member, someone they were close to. This happens. So telepathy happens. And telepathy is not just reading somebody's mind. You get emotions, you get feelings of sense of presence, you get vertical, you
Right.
Mhm.
get tactile. This is all part of telepathy as well. So they
Okay.
Mhm.
made this connection years and years and years ago.
Mhm.
What I do is I kind of break it down more, um, um, using a little bit more of what's going on nowadays to back up maybe what's happening there, and
Okay.
a lot of my own flavor in there, which is the psychological, how does that impact us internally, and the magnetic sense and magnetic fields from us sort of leaking
Mhm.
out into the environment, and entanglement, and some of these things
Mhm.
that they didn't have back in, I can't remember when they wrote that, 1880 something.
1880s. Yeah. That's a long time ago.
Yeah. So, back then it was ether,
Yeah.
so yeah. So I took a lot of things and implemented some of my own thoughts into it. But these ideas, the psi hypothesis for ghosts has been around for years and years. And it goes from phantasm, it goes to Terrell's apparitions, goes to
Right.
Hornell Hart's 6 Theories of Apparitions, to The Enigma of Survival, which is an amazing book.
Yep.
So all these things, and even Harry Price has a lot of theories in there that are kind of mixed up here. So as we move forward, the research is really going in a certain way. And my book, I just try to update it and make it a little bit more appealing to people living in 2020 as opposed to 1800. Because if you read a book in the 1800s, it is a chore to read.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Chore to
I have
read.
both volumes of that, and it's a chore to read that.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, it's good stuff, but it's a chore. So one of the things I want to ask is, when you talked about the changes in the internal energy and the bioenergetics, the external information acquisition. So it kind of has to go from you. Let's say you're in a crisis situation, you're dying, or you do die, and it's traumatic, and there's lots of emotions, and it has to go into the environment, and then somebody else needs to pick it up. So could you explain a little bit what your ideas are around that?
Well, when it gets into the environment, I really think Sheldrake and his thoughts on morphic fields and sort of entanglement and resonating and these types of things, as well as Persinger and some of his colleagues, entanglement or non-locality, which sort of describes it. Let's say this information does somehow get into the environment, right? Let's just agree to that. How does it get from point A to point B, right? That's really the struggle with a lot of things that we talk about, right? So entanglement or non-locality sort of describes the ability of objects to instantaneously know about each other's state, even when they're separated by extreme distances.
Right.
And when you have this synchronization, this is when information is sort of transported or shared. And the type of information comes in form of like feelings, hunches, things like that. And
the consciousness, maybe? I don't know.
Consciousness is part of it. But what happens is that this idea of non-locality or entanglement is kind of assumed to happen in a quantum level, like micro, right? Subatomic level.
Okay.
But does it happen in a macro level, which is in the world we live in today? And I think that there's some research out there that says that this can happen in a normal, it doesn't have to happen quantum, it can happen in a normal macro level. And that's really where I see the connection happening.
Dave? I'm sorry, we're having a little bit of trouble here. Dave, I don't hear you.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, maybe you can hear me now. I was going to say, Brandon, but I think they're showing that there's more entanglement in macromolecules now. It's like it's getting bigger and bigger, right? Yeah, I mean, some of it is there. So, I mean, what you're saying is, yeah, there's entanglement, and if you think about it, if the very basis of consciousness, as some think, is an action potential and neuron fires, then it leads to all kinds of cascades and synchronization, oscillation. If the idea of a brain or action potential firing is ones and zeros, that's only one little bit of information, right? So why wouldn't it be able to be somewhat entangled and then transduced into a signal through the entire consciousness?
Yeah. So
I mean, I don't think it's as far-fetched as some skeptics maybe claim it is.
Yeah, and I didn't know that it was getting more macro. That's actually, pretty interesting to me, as far as what's out there that you're referencing. That's really the key. When we look at telepathy, when we look at psi phenomenon, if for some reason entanglement does happen, or anything like this happens, then that really opens the door. If it happens on a macro level between people, obviously, that opens the door to every paranormal phenomenon that's out there. right? It really does, and I think that, as research and science sort of move towards trying to figure that out, I think that's really important. The research that I talk about in the book was that they would separate siblings,
Mm-hmm.
one in one room. One, I think they had one sibling in a room that was completely dark. So they separated the siblings. They put complex magnetic fields around the temporal lobe of one of
Yep.
the siblings. They put another sibling in another room, and they showed that when they put the magnetic fields around one sibling,
Mm-hmm.
it showed changes in the other.
Mm.
Uh, they put rotating magnetic fields around their heads. Person A was in a completely dark room, and person B was located in a different room. And when they stimulated light in person B, the person in the black room, who shouldn't have any sort of light in their eyes, was showing light in their eyes in a way. So
Mm-hmm.
complex rotating magnetic fields, when applied to both of them, somehow synchronized. They
Hmm.
separated participants by over 3,000 miles. Entanglement happened. They did studies with people with psychic abilities, and when the psychic and the subject's EEGs resonated or became similar, sort of a synchronization happened, and the psychic's readings were better. They were more on target. So when synchronization
Interesting.
happens, there's some increase in hits, as they call it.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that when synchronization happens, they're able to get some sort of information from the environment or something like that, or reading a person's brain or telepathy or something like that. So there is this idea that they kind of had this notion where certain rotating magnetic fields around two people increase the likelihood of synchronization happening. Now, that's where people are in a laboratory manipulating it.
Right.
Now,
Mm.
can this happen in a normal environment? I think it does, but it takes a lot of these complex things that I talked about before happening for it to occur. So these crisis apparitions don't happen every time somebody dies.
Right.
Mm.
But, again, we could get some sort of telepathic message from somebody right now, and it happens at an unconscious level, and it just doesn't ever come to consciousness for me, right? It just stays below. So we may be getting more of these messages than we think about, but perhaps the ones that are more emotionally powered or charged are ones that come to consciousness a little bit better than everything else, which is why research is showing that these crisis apparitions at times of life-threatening events are more prevalent than normal day-to-day telepathy.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely.
Definitely. So, okay. All right.
Good
Jen,
explanation.
anything else there?
Oh God, I have a whole list, but he's went through a lot of it already. But let's see. Yeah, you've explained a lot already. Let's see. Sorry, I'm blind. I need my glasses.
And what's good
Sorry.
about the book, and I'll while you're looking through there, is I do have, like I mentioned, I have a lot of references in there. So if you don't believe
Mhm.
me, you can
Mhm.
always look up the research article yourself.
Okay.
Right.
I know we touched a little bit on this just a bit earlier, but could you possibly describe the collective unconscious and what part does morphic resonance play in it?
Oh gosh, collective unconscious. um, collective unconscious really started with Carl Jung.
Mhm.
Mhm.
If for those who don't know, Carl Jung was um, buddies with Freud. We'll simplify it pretty much, but he's buddies with Freud. So he's very prominent in psychology. And one of his ideas was this idea that consciousness or even unconsciousness, um, it could be shared.
Mhm.
It wasn't just simply my own individual experience from birth to death.
Mhm.
Jung proposed that there are parts of the unconscious mind that are common to all humans. These things are frequently called archetypes.
Mhm.
You probably heard a lot of these
Mhm.
as we go through. They're all over the place. Um, Jung was also the first person to talk about synchronicity, which is very big in the paranormal
Mhm.
field right
Yep.
now. But he believed that we're not sort of born a blank slate. We're born with these traits that are generally passed down from our ancestors all the way from the beginning of
Blueprints.
Blueprints, yes, exactly. And these blueprints sort of give us a little bit of add some information to our blank tablet when we're born. And he believed that these areas sort of consisted of a collection of experiences of the entire human species from its beginning,
Mhm.
right? And that opens the door, right? So that's this idea that we're getting information from somewhere. We're not just learning it as we're born. So
Right.
there's information we're going into life with.
Mhm.
Uh, and I mentioned in the book, I talk about My Life as a Turkey, which is a PBS documentary.
Mhm.
And what it is this guy um, found 12 turkey eggs, and he raised them from the moment that they were hatched.
Mhm.
And there were certain things the turkeys already knew, which are sort of like instincts, and they had a blueprint for the world. There were
Mhm.
certain things that they had to be taught.
Right.
So this idea is that we're getting some information
Right.
unconsciously from previous things.
Mhm.
uh, Morphic resonance, that has to do with Rupert Sheldrake, who, if anyone's interested, just look him up and read some of his stuff. But he proposes that memory is sort of inherent in nature, and that the brain is more of a tuning system than a memory storage system.
Mhm.
So Sheldrake's collective memory hypothesis kind of expands on Jung's collective unconsciousness, but it states that we don't just inherit primitive instincts and archetypes from our ancestors, we can continue to inherit as well as share memories, experiences, and information from those around us. So it's not
Hmm.
just the past, we're continuing to do it now.
That's
Um,
awesome.
and his idea was that consciousness is not really stored in the brain. So memory is not material inside the brains, it's more like TV receivers.
Mhm.
And you
Mhm.
sort of
Exactly. Mhm.
Yep.
so the existence of morphic fields and morphic resonance indicate that our minds are not confined to our brains, but rather they involve sort of fields that extend beyond our brains and bodies. And it kind of, in a way, links organisms to the environment and to each other.
Mm.
He has a whole series of books on this. And it's really fascinating and interesting things that are alternative thoughts and theories, which get bashed, but to some degree, Rupert Sheldrake I think he's an Oxford trained biologist.
Yep.
So he's
Yep.
not some new age guy on at 9 a.m. selling you crystals. Uh,
Mhm.
and the
Right.
same with Carl Jung. He is a amazing psychoanalyst who still has followers and um, trainings on how he handled patients in 2020, stuff that he was doing
Mhm.
in the early
Nice.
1900s. So these aren't people that are just, fraudsters or snake oil salesmen. These are people with legitimate academic backgrounds. Um, did I answer
Definitely.
the question, or did I ramble on?
Yeah,
No, that was great. Yeah.
that's good. So, I mean, you look at that and you're starting to kind of tread into psychology, and maybe we can talk a little bit about your role as a clinical therapist. And I think in chapter 10 of your book, you talk about not everything's paranormal. We all
Mhm.
know that not everything is paranormal. We have to accept that. We acknowledge that. And I think that makes people better investigators and researchers if we do that.
Mhm.
So you mentioned things like schizophrenia, reality testing deficits, transliminality absorption, fantasy proneness, ambiguous stimulation, as well as sleep paralysis. So my question to you, as a practicing clinical therapist, how do you tell the difference between those type of things and potentially a real anomalous paranormal experience?
it it I don't think that there's a great answer for that. As far as mental illness, it comes with experience. So I could probably tell the difference between someone who's um, actively hallucinating or has schizophrenia or delusional disorder, as opposed to a paranormal experience. You tend to
Right.
see some things that are common among schizophrenics, schizoaffective, things like that. Their hallucinations tend to sometimes be consistent. The delusions are not necessarily paranormal related. They have more to do with paranoia. um, Schizophrenia, it's a lot of command hallucinations and things like. So there's a lot of people think schizophrenics are often having these paranormal experiences, when in
Mm.
actuality their actual auditory and visual hallucinations, even tactile hallucinations, don't really um, aren't really paranormal, at least in my experience. It's more like a twisted reality than it is paranormal.
Oh.
Very rarely do a schizophrenic come up and talk about a ghost living next to them. It's more like, some very overt delusion,
Okay.
So how do you tell the difference between an illusion or what they think is I guess, how do I say that? Because
Like a hallucination, or
yeah, and
that
I
might
mean,
be
how they
paranormally induced.
sometimes they see things differently and they describe them differently, and maybe, I mean, do you ever see that they're describing them as real life, or is that,
Mhm.
do they describe that differently? I'm not sure.
So when you diagnose schizophrenia, it's not just hallucinations. There's a lot of things that come with it.
Okay.
Word salad, uh, negative symptoms. There's there's a lot of criteria that come with schizophrenia. So usually, if you have someone that's just hallucinating, maybe once every month or so, it's not so detrimental that it impacts their day-to-day life.
Hmm.
So they wouldn't really meet criteria for schizophrenia per se. Um, there's a lot of other symptoms that go with diagnosing schizophrenia, which I won't bore everyone with, but
Okay.
it's something that a clinician could look up in the DSM-5 is what they call it, and you have to meet certain criteria to be diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Hmm.
Just having one hallucination is not going to do it.
Okay.
So paranormal, usually you'll come across someone who might have reports seeing ghosts or paranormal phenomenon. It's not all day, every day, and they generally go about their normal lives. It's not impacting them too much. They do whatever. Um,
So it's pretty
Okay.
clear to you then.
it is.
Okay.
I worked in the ERs for 6 years, so
Mhm.
I've seen a numerous
Okay.
schizophrenics. Not once. Uh, you know, uh, Very rarely did a schizophrenic ever discuss ghosts or anything like
Okay.
that.
Okay.
So one of the things you mentioned is transliminality,
Mhm.
and I'd like to ask you about that because there's been a lot of publications, and you see it in the parapsychological literature about transliminality. And you go back into the work by Tyrell, Apparitions, where this whole idea that you get this idea pattern that's received in the subconsciousness, and it kind of works itself out and bubbles up to the consciousness where you're perceiving it, and you see what's happening, or you experience what's happening. So transliminality, it seems, is that something that could be mistaken for the paranormal, or is that some sort of factor that contributes to being able to experience and actually pick up on true paranormal experiences?
Yeah. So transliminality, I mean, it's definitely not my specialty, but it's this idea where your unconscious is sort of leaking into your consciousness, right?
Mhm.
Uh,
Right.
Imagery, effect, perceptions. Somehow in your
Hmm.
unconscious, it's
Mhm.
leaking into your consciousness.
Yeah, it's like a very thin barrier between the two.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if that is happening, um, you may be getting some things that aren't based in reality, but more in your unconscious thing.
Hmm.
Now, there is numerous research, and you're right. There is numerous research which correlates transliminality to um, paranormal beliefs and paranormal experiences. I don't know. I can't speak intelligently on that to some degree because I'm not a person that reads quite extensively on transliminality.
Okay.
When you talk about Tyrrell, which, for those who don't know, he wrote a book. You're talking about the book Apparitions in the 19.
Correct. Yep.
Tyrell.
Is it
Tyrrell. Yeah.
is it Tyrrell or
Tyrrell.
Tyrell?
Tyrell.
I
Tyrell.
never
It
know
doesn't
which.
matter.
What?
He
We'll
wrote
go with both.
an extremely fascinating book, which anyone who's interested in ghosts should read. Um, but if you recall, Tyrrell believed telepathy was happening,
Hmm.
right? So in order for these idea patterns to sort of happen outside, it involved. So the idea patterns happen, and then they sort of come out in hallucinations in a way, in a kind of a weird way. It's not like clinical hallucinations, but
Right.
the start of it has to do with telepathy. So person A was sending somewhat of a message of distress to person B. Person B got that message of distress and sort of created their own play inside their head, taking the information unconsciously and then shooting it out. So,
Yeah.
so his basis is basically psi, or thought transference, or telepathy.
Right, but I think his point was that it's that first initial seed or idea pattern is perceived in the subconscious.
Yes.
And it has to work its way up. And one of the things that's been in the publications and something that we've looked at with people having experiences is that when you measure transliminality with the transliminality scale, there's actually a question set, as you know, that you can measure that. People who tend to have more paranormal experiences seem to have that thinner boundary.
Yep.
Which is interesting, because to me, it's like, okay, if what Terrell said and what people are seeing now, if this whole psi thing is subconscious, and actually, if you look at the dream telepathy studies, when you're, sleeping and you kind of inhibit your consciousness, that you seem to have better success in receiving signals when it maybe implies that it's subconscious. So it seems like something that seems to stick throughout the decades with the research.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. I don't know if it's right or not. It's just kind of from my reading, I look at it and go, that's an interesting thing that seems to stick over probably 100 years or so.
Yeah. I'm like I said, I'm a fan of transliminality. I think it's, as far as research goes, I think it, in parapsychology at least, I think it's utilized quite a bit, but it could still be utilized more. We could still learn more about it. And, and we talked about this a little bit before. So people who are in meditative states or are laying down for the night or in a quiet atmosphere, they tend to be more conducive to having some sort of paranormal experience, right? Why is that? Would I see a ghost if I was in a club with glow sticks running around and doing things? Probably not, right? But because my mind is a little bit slower or more eased or quiet, then I tend to have these experiences. And it goes back to this idea that, maybe we're getting a lot of these telepathic things happening more often than we think, but in certain states, it just pops to the head more than other states.
Right. We're not always receiving them at the right time, right place.
Well, it hits us unconsciously, but for some reason in certain states, it goes from unconscious to conscious, which is what Dave's talking about.
Okay.
So those people who are transliminality, they have a shorter boundary, so it moves there faster. Right. Is that kind of what you're saying, Dave?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at or thinking. Yeah.
So if telepathy is happening unconsciously, if it's hitting us unconsciously, those who are higher on the transliminality scale, it's going to shift back into consciousness more than a person who has a very thick boundary, transliminality.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So let me ask you, and I got it. We hear this all the time. What is your take when certain, I would say, skeptics, and then you bleed into cynics who just don't believe anything? What do you say to the skeptics that, or how do you respond to them that say that a lot of this is pseudoscience and you're talking about things that aren't proven and there's no consensus? What is your response to that type of reaction to the work you've done and the work you've cited by others?
Well, it's something I struggle with that quite a bit. The one thing you kind of want to do is you want to lash out, or you want to send them 17 journal articles, saying why psi has some
Been
you know what I'm saying?
Doesn't work.
Again, yeah, you could send a lot of, for someone who's a cynic or an ardent skeptic, they might get the articles and they might not read them, or they don't really care. So I struggle sometimes with that. I try to be in the middle. So,
right.
The paranormal field is kind of similar to politics, as everyone in the paranormal knows. There's the far right and there's the far left.
Right.
So, so similar to politics, confirmation bias is sort of a disease in the paranormal field. And confirmation bias is sort of this tendency to search for, or favor, interpret, or recall information that strengthens your belief, your personal beliefs, and your hypothesis.
Right.
And people really display this belief when they gather information selectively and they interpret it in a biased way. Now, this goes both ways. So ardent believers feel that ghosts, spirits, and souls are these discardant entities that roam the earth due to tragedy, unfinished business, or whatever else. This Zach Baggins ghost hunter view on paranormal phenomena. And pop culture, unfortunately, pushes this belief down people's throat.
Yeah.
And for me, I don't like the idea that one's soul or consciousness is doomed to roam the earth for trivial reasons,
Yeah.
or because they weren't buried right. So the idea that one's consciousness is hiding in the ruins of a house waiting for someone to show them the light.
Right.
Or worse yet, a cemetery. Ugh, that's the worst.
Exactly.
I don't know about you, but I'm not haunting a cemetery if I come back.
I mean, it's just crazy.
But as
Anyway.
we step back, what would you want? I don't want my grandpa or my grandma or my dog even to be languishing in torture in some dream state running around the earth. I find that hard to believe. And then skeptics, they think everything. Again, there's middle grounds and continuum. So I'm going to use the far right here, but attention-seeking behaviors, misremembering, people don't understand how the world works. People are naive. That's why they're having these experiences. Everything's natural, things like that. So you kind of go back and forth with what's right and what's wrong. I try not to really engage or conflict them too much. If they have certain questions for me, they are more than welcome to call. Not, I shouldn't say call because nobody calls anymore.
I still do. I'm old though,
They'll text or message you.
Email me. And for people who, how do you manage skeptics or how do you talk to them? I really don't know if there's a right or wrong way to do it. I try to be open-minded. I try to listen, but I don't get pushed around, and I don't like people stomping on me.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's really where you have to set a little bit of boundary.
But skepticism's good. Cynicism,
Right.
that's where it's bad.
Yeah. And it's something that's, like I said, it goes both ways. I gotten
You have
texts.
to have a healthy relationship with the whole overall, what you're looking at.
Yeah.
You got to weigh things, and you have to,
What's weird is they tend to have the same argument, like we talked about blueprints, right? The first thing they do is they say they're open-minded, right? Believers talk about being a skeptic once, or cite a skeptic book that they or when they debunk something. Skeptics will pine over how interesting the field is and how they once believed, how they wished ghosts and psi were real, and they'll cite books that they've read that provide this idea that they're open-minded. Usually it's Phantasms for the Living. I don't know why. They both say that research is flawed, right? Believers say there's no amount of research that's going to prove ghosts exist. They discredit the research and its motivations. Science and research is flawed. No one could test the unknown. Skeptics, same thing. They say there's not enough research. If more research is presented to them that goes against their belief, they say it's not by the right people or the research is flawed or biased. They critique writing style. Believers say the book, specifically my book, it's too technical, not enough case studies, geared towards academics. Skeptics, it's geared towards a general audience. It's not technical enough. It has too many case studies. They attack me. They attack the references. So the blueprint is really the same. So the far right and the far left. The problem comes when, you don't really get anywhere with those types of thinking or behaviors. You squash you insult them, you squash them, which is sort of what politics really is. And that's what's really most disheartening of everything. I read a review that said, oh gosh, I can't remember what it said. I had it written down somewhere. Oh, there's always the possibility that they might be true in talking about my theories. Human emotions might affect a person's electrical field. Then that spreads so far as to interact with the Earth's magnetic fields, transmitting information to another person who tunes into the field and receives the message that looks like a ghost. So this person was not positive about my book. But the key thing to think about there is there's always the possibility that this might be true. This is what's
Of
disheartening.
course.
If there's
But-
even a shred of a possibility, the thinking should be, let's look further into this.
Right.
Science and simply knowledge is the pursuit of truth, even when the truth goes against what you believe.
Right.
So this is confirmation at its finest. The
Mhm.
possibility it could be true, but I'm going to shit all over it.
Right.
If it doesn't fit into their belief system,
Right.
therefore to pursue it is absurd, even
Mhm.
if there's a possibility it might be true.
Well, that's the
So do you
big
think
difference. Sorry, go ahead.
do you think they're guilty of the same confirmation bias that the true believers are that don't ever question anything?
Yes. No progress is made with this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like this thinking is designed to insult, to control people with differing opinions.
Right.
And this is what happens in far right and far left in politics.
Right.
Exact. Yeah.
So, this idea where there's always the possibility it might be true, but I'm going to shit all over it and I'm not going to look into it. I'm going to call it
Right.
absurd. To
Right.
me, that is confirmation bias at its finest.
Yep.
And you could have confirmation bias and be skeptical or cynicism or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
You can do the same thing as an ardent believer. It goes both ways, and you really want to be in the middle. The problem is being in the middle, you don't get the likes, the shares, the conflict, the drama, and things
Well,
like that.
Yeah, but being in the middle is where the real truth and the real knowledge comes from.
Right. And that gives you your own personal reasoning for doing what you're doing. And I think that's what you need to focus on as yourself and what you're looking to get out of it. And, I think majority of the people should be looking for their own truth, which means, weighing both sides equally and seeing, what they think is, and if they lean one way or another, good for them. That's their thing. But I think they should look equally on both sides, just like you said. I think it's a great point, an excellent point.
Yeah, good point.
Confirmation bias is a disease.
Yeah,
Yep.
it is.
We-
And
we-
It is.
we
every
all-
walk of life has it too. It's,
I can't say I've never done it in my life. Sometimes I'll read an article, a headline, I'll look through it and I go, oh man, this says exactly what I believe. And then I
Right.
read it. And then, did I fact check it? Did I look at the references, make sure it's
Yeah.
something that actually is true?
Right.
Maybe I just retweeted it before I even did that. And that's confirmation bias.
Yeah. We're all guilty of it,
Yeah, but I think it's important to interact both. If you're a believer, interact with a skeptic. If you're a skeptic, interact with a believer.
Yeah.
Try to get differing perspectives
Yeah.
and talk about it in an adult, professional way.
Yes, exactly. Do it, cleanly without, a lot of finger pointing and, name calling, because we know a lot of people who do that. And that's just so disheartening,
Yeah,
because it shouldn't be like that.
it should be positive. It should be a learning experience for
Yeah.
everybody
Yeah.
because we don't have all the answers.
Yeah. And part of me wants to be like, oh, para-unity type stuff. And
Where'd you get that term? Oh my God.
We're not. That's a whole nother show.
Oh,
just-
geez. Okay.
you come across, and it's just like politics.
Yeah.
Somebody's Twitter page has thoughts on Trump or anti-Trump.
Yeah.
It's just constantly one after another, and it's like their opinions mean. It's like I can't. You try to talk to them, and but sometimes there's no budging them, and I think
Yeah.
at some point we have to realize it's okay to walk away and
Yep.
not engage, and it's okay to walk away and not engage. It doesn't mean that I lost.
Nope.
There's plenty of times in the clinical world where people will get upset and they'll get angry, and do I yell at them back? Does that help? No. Sometimes I have to sort of disengage and go, we're not getting anywhere right now. We have
Right.
to take a step back, and if we don't want
Right.
to see each other again, that's fine. And all this type of stuff.
Right. So good. So one last question. Are you still involved in the field, and are you conducting any field work or research right now?
No, I'm still involved in the field. I'm doing a lot more writing than I've done probably in the past years.
So what's your Facebook page? I've noticed you do a lot of good posts there, and you have a
Oh, yeah,
website too.
Haunted Theories. Hauntedtheories.com is my Facebook, Twitter, and website.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah, I follow that. It's a lot of great information. I would encourage people to go there if you want to learn more and really get some good information. So, well, I don't have anything else, but I'd like to say thanks, Brandon. It was a joy to have you on the show and really enjoyed the conversation. And I would encourage everybody to go out and buy and check out the Ghost Studies. It's a great book. It's going to provide a lot of good information. It has a ton of references, as Brandon said, and it's just a phenomenally well-written book. And it's for the layperson that can understand very complex ideas that have just been discussed in the scientific literature and parapsychology. And I think you'll really enjoy it. So, Brandon, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, we'll talk to you a little bit after.